We're getting pretty close now to the release of probably one of the most anticipated new releases this year, being the Resident Evil 4 remake. And I just wanted to sit down and have a chat about it, because personally I'm super excited for this game. I just pre-ordered my copy, so I'll be playing it on day one, but I do have some things on my mind about it, and just some things that I want to talk about that I think would make for an interesting small video. And I'm also just curious where you guys are at with this upcoming remake. Are you guys skeptical about it, or is it just full on hype and excitement ready for the game to release? There's also just a lot resting on this game, from both the future of the Resident Evil franchise to the expectations that people might have from this game. Because the original Resident Evil 4 has such a huge legacy behind it, and it's known as not only one of the best Resident Evil games, but also just as one of the best survival horror games. So remaking a classic like that probably comes with a lot of expectations, and because of these reasons, I do think that it's an interesting game to remake. Personally, I'm also relatively new to this franchise. I only got into it around 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, with Resident Evil 1. And since then I played Resident Evil 1, the 2 remake, 3 remake, 0, 4 and 5. And honestly, I've really enjoyed all of them, some a bit more than others of course. But even though I did get into the franchise 2-3 years ago, and the games are really short, I always take really big breaks between playing them. So I only recently finished Resident Evil 4, and I really loved it, and I can definitely see why this game is being called a masterpiece. But playing the game also made me so much more excited for this remake. And I'm just really curious to see how the developers are gonna handle a remake like this. But before we dive into it, if you like this video, why not leave a like or check out my channel? All the support is greatly appreciated, and I cannot thank you enough. But now, let's talk about this remake. And personally, I have really high hopes for it. There is a lot pointing towards this remake being a success, going off of interviews and some articles, trailers and just pure gameplay footage. The game so far looks really promising. Especially because every time a new trailer is released or new gameplay is shown, I can look at it and point at the exact moment or area or fight that they're trying to recreate from the original. And that is something that a remake should strive for. It all looks really faithful, from the village to the castle to the enemy designs to the boss designs to Leon's quirky one-liners and him just running up to an enemy and kicking them in the face. It's really just Resident Evil, but it looks a lot better and it looks like it plays a lot better as well, which is pretty obvious since it is a Resident Evil 4 remake. So of course it looks like Resident Evil 4, but remade. But you never really know nowadays what developers have in mind when they say, we are gonna remake this game. Because remakes are happening a lot more often lately. And because of that, there are so many more types of remakes. And there are also a lot of remakes that fail to recapture what the original did. And by the looks of it, this looks like it's gonna be the best type of remake, to say it that way. Kind of in the same vein as the recent Dead Space remake. Instead of being a remake like Demon's Souls or The Last of Us, which is more an exact one-to-one remake, the only changes were pretty small, making the gameplay experience smoother, but not really bringing the game design up to a new level. They were just bringing the game back one-to-one, with smoother gameplay and a really big focus on the visuals. Or instead of the Final Fantasy VII remake, which is more of a reimagining, and instead of a remake, it kind of feels like the next chapter in the Final Fantasy VII compilation. Now, I don't mean anything negative on those remakes, I played all of them and I love all of them, but from the looks of it, the Resident Evil 4 remake doesn't look like just a one-to-one remake. But on the other hand, it also doesn't look like they're completely reimagining it. They actually just took a really close look at the original and looked at what works and what doesn't work. Like in interviews, they gave a concrete example of this, being the QuickTime events. Because the original had a lot of QuickTime events, it was kind of a product of its time, as you see it in a lot of games from back then. So they looked at these QuickTime events and got rid of them. But of course, you can't just get rid of a major gameplay element from a game without replacing it with anything. So what they did is, they made a fully fledged melee combat system, where you use your knife and you can use it to parry and block and all of that stuff. Which is a very similar approach to a remake as the Dead Space remake had, as I mentioned earlier. I didn't play that game personally, I'm definitely planning on it, but there are so many games coming out, so I'm just holding out on that one and keeping it for a later date. But I do know someone who played the original and is now playing through the remake. And from what he said, it sounds like Resident Evil is doing very similar things to this Dead Space remake. Like, in the original Dead Space, you didn't have the QuickTime events, but instead you had turret sections. And those turret sections didn't age that well. But in the remake, they replaced them with a new gameplay element that makes it a lot more fun and more fitting as a product of this modern time. And changes like that really elevate a remake from just a one-to-one recreation or from a complete reimagining to the definitive way to play that game. And as I said, from the looks of it, Resident Evil is aiming for the same result, just making Resident Evil 4, but making it as if it was made today, with modern game design elements, but still keeping it Resident Evil 4. It's especially interesting if you listen to some interviews, because the development team sounds really passionate about this game. Not only about your remake, but about the original as well. There's one line in specific that really stood out to me, or one answer to a question that stood out to me, from a Game Informer interview, and I'm just gonna play the clip for this.
まあそのにもう名作として名高いんで、まあ難しいっていうので最初はまあやりたくなかったんですけど、まあ話を受けてまあある程度じゃあ自分らでちょっと改めて見てみるって言ってプレイしてみんなで意見を一回出した時に、まあ名作とはいえ今見るとやっぱりまだ改善の余地はあるよねっていうのがまあ感じられたんで、チーム内でもそこにちょっとこう光が見えたという感じですね。
As you can see, they admire the original so much that at first they didn't even feel the need to do a remake, and only after replaying it is when they decided, okay, it is a masterpiece, but it's 17 years old, so it does have some room for updates, and it does have some things that maybe didn't age that well, which is completely normal. It's not just a remake, it's a remake made by people that love the original and that want to keep the core experience of the original intact. But at the same time, they're not afraid to make changes where it's necessary, like the QuickTime events. They aren't just a small thing here and there. One of the most iconic boss fights in that game was entirely a QuickTime event, and they decided to change it, because it would make for a better experience. They're not tying themselves down to recreating the original, one-to-one as close as possible. Story-wise as well, from what I've heard in interviews, they're even adding some more connections to Resident Evil 2, which is where we lost Sally on, making it so there's a stronger connection between the games, and so it feels more natural when you look at how the game fits into the franchise. Which is something that I personally really appreciate, and I love the idea of it. Because as much as I love the Resident Evil franchise so far, continuity is a thing that I definitely want to see more of, and it's probably the thing that bothers me the most about this franchise. Like, the last time we saw Leon in Resident Evil 2 is when he was escaping Raccoon City. He's together with Claire, he's together with Cherry, just the three of them walking down a dirt road. But the next time we see him, he's working for the president, trying to rescue the president's daughter in this random village. What happened to him and Claire? What happened to Cherry? I know that there's a lot of Resident Evil side media that ties things together, like maybe there's a movie or a novel or whatever out there that connects this specific plot thread, but I always just wanted something small in the game itself, just showing how we got there. Maybe this isn't exactly what we're getting in the remake, since we have no details at all on the entire continuity thing, but I'm already happy that the devs said that there will be more connections, be it in the form of flashbacks or just new lines of dialogue. going over that type of stuff. And looking at all of these things, it just makes me really happy to see how open the devs are with the entire development process and with the entirety of the game, really. We've had so much gameplay shown already. We get new trailers all the time, the developers are doing interviews all the time. Review embargo is gonna lift 1 week before release, so everyone can look at the review scores and have enough time to make their decision on their purchase. We're even getting a fully playable demo before release. They are so open about their work on the game, which can only be a good sign, since you gotta be pretty confident in what you're making if you're showing it off so much. But I also get why they're showing this off so much, because it's the Resident Evil 4 remake. Again, it's one of the best survival horror games out there, and a game that's literally perfect in the eyes of a lot of people, so they probably had to convince some hardcore fans that the game is in good hands. And fair enough, especially after the track record that Resident Evil has with remakes. Not counting Resident Evil 1, since that remake came out in like 2002, but we got 2 recent Resident Evil remakes. One of them being incredible with Resident Evil 2, and the other one being not so incredible with Resident Evil 3. Now, I haven't played the original Resident Evil 2, but from what I've heard, the remake apparently lives up to the original. A lot of people also consider Resident Evil 2 Remake to be one of their favorite Resident Evil games. And while I didn't play the original, I did play the remake and I absolutely loved it. And I don't feel like I'm really missing out by not playing the original. But then you look at the Resident Evil 3 remake, and when I played it, again, not having played the original, while I enjoyed it, I was kind of disappointed and it felt really short. But then, because of this feeling, I looked a bit deeper into it, and so much stuff got cut from Resident Evil 3, it's actually insane. And unlike with Resident Evil 2 Remake, I do feel like I'm missing out by not playing the original. And every now and then I do think about going back and playing the original Resident Evil 3. So while it might be a good game in a vacuum, comparing it to the original, which is something that you should do with a remake, the Resident Evil 3 remake definitely falls flat. So looking at this, we have one incredible remake and one bad remake, let's say. So I can see why people are skeptical, but I'm sure that Capcom knows that they went wrong with Resident Evil 3. They got a lot of backlash on it, so I doubt that they're gonna make the same mistake again. The director from the Resident Evil 4 remake was also the director of the Resident Evil 2 remake, by the way, so he probably knows what he's doing. The only thing that's gotten me a bit skeptical on the game though is one of the additions that they added, with the merchant now giving you side quests. Like, when I was playing through the original Resident Evil 4, I never once got a thought in my head that this game is missing side quests. But apparently the devs thought that the game would benefit from having them. I don't really know how they would fit into the game, because the original was very streamlined, very linear, straight to the point, and very, very well paced. And I'm just kinda worried that they're gonna mess with this pacing. Of course, you can always say, oh, if the side quests mess with the pacing, why not just ignore them? But if the game is better when you ignore a part of it, if you ignore the side quests, then why are they even there? Now, I'm not saying that the remake is doomed because of this or anything like that. We don't know a lot about these subquests. They might be a really good addition to the game and I might end up loving them once I actually play the game. But I guess a lot of the skepticism just comes down to the original being as good as it is. And when there are changes being made, we always just have to wait and see on whether or not the new version can live up to the original. But now the last thing that I want to touch upon is, what does this remake mean for the future of the Resident Evil franchise? Because Resident Evil has definitely fallen into this pattern within the last few years, switching between a new game release with 7 or 8, and then these remakes with 2, 3, and now 4. Looking back, I honestly wasn't even sure whether or not they were gonna go this far with the remakes. Like, ignoring the Resident Evil 1 remake again, because I want to talk about the recent remakes. Remaking Resident Evil 2 and 3 made a lot of sense. Those games were just not available on modern platforms. They also aged quite a bit, being from 1998 and 99, so porting them or just remastering them simply wouldn't have been enough. But Resident Evil 4 already had a remaster. It was readily available on every system, so much so that it even got memed since they just kept re-releasing it like Skyrim. So at first, I was kind of double on it. One part of me thought, of course they're gonna remake it, it's fucking Resident Evil 4. But on the other side, Resident Evil 2 and 3 were not available, Resident Evil 4 is available, so maybe they're just gonna stop with 3, so every single game in the franchise is readily available. But now we have the Resident Evil 4 remake, which shows that it's not just about availability. So what now? Are they gonna continue this trend and remake 5 and 6? Or are they gonna go back and remake Resident Evil 1? Because after the Resident Evil 4 remake, all the games will be available on current gen. Resident Evil 2 and 3 got remade for PS4, but they got their free next-gen update. Resident Evil 4, 7, and 8 are native current-gen games. So all that's left, or all that's missing on the current generation, is a native version of Resident Evil 1, 5, and 6. But to be honest, even if the PS4 version of Resident Evil 1 is just a remaster of a remake from 2002, it honestly holds up incredibly well in my opinion. But I still don't want to rule out a remake, because I have seen a lot of people talk about Resident Evil 1, and how they would love a new remake of that game in the style of Resident Evil 2, since they just can't get used to the classic camera angles or that style of gameplay, and it is still a pretty big jump going from Resident Evil 1 to 2. In the same way that the jump from Resident Evil 3, original or remake, was pretty big to Resident Evil 4, since Resident Evil 4 was a lot more action-focused and had the tank controls, but your remakes are now gonna make that transition from 3 to 4 a lot smoother. So there's always a chance for a Resident Evil 2 style remake of 1, and honestly I think it would be pretty cool. But then looking at Resident Evil 5 and 6, since they are from the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 generation, they didn't really age as much as some of the other games in the franchise, but they also don't have that extremely positive reputation. Plus, they're all available on modern platforms, even if it's not natively a next-gen game. So part of me thinks that, for these reasons, they won't get a remake treatment. But at the same time, I kinda hope that they remake these games, because while 5 was a very flawed game, the controls were kinda janky and the game in general just wasn't that good. And while I didn't even play 6 yet, I know about the reputation that 6 has, and that not a lot of people like that game. So maybe a remake for those games could fix that reputation, you never know. They can also continue the remake streak in another direction, of course, by remaking a fan favorite Code Veronica, but I don't really know if a remake of a side game would gather as much mainstream excitement as a mainline remake. But then again, maybe a remake of 1 or a remake of 2 of the most disappointing games in the franchise also won't pull a lot of hype. Now, if for some reason Resident Evil 4 remake turns out to be a massive flop, then I'm sure they're just gonna end this remake streak and move on to focusing on new games like Resident Evil 9 or maybe a new side game. But if this remake does well, I feel like they might continue with these remakes, going maybe to 5, 6, back to 1, Code Veronica, I don't know. The future of Resident Evil is kind of unclear after Resident Evil 4 remake, but I'm really curious and excited, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. But that's basically everything that I had to say on this situation, and I would honestly just love to hear what you all are thinking. Are you all excited? Are you still skeptical? Do you want this remake streak to continue with 5, Code Veronica, or even 1? Just let me know your thoughts in the comments, I'm really curious. But that's it for me in this video. Be sure to leave a like, and if you want even more from me for some reason, I have a Twitter account, I'll leave it in the description as always. And you can also check out my channel, where I make more casual discussion videos like this, but also some more scripted reviews, and just videos on gaming in general. So if you're interested, be sure to check it out, but with that, I hope you all enjoyed, and hopefully I'll see you again soon.